Hello again, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Land Sector and Removals Guidance Development and the Science-Based Targets Initiative Forest, Land, and Ag Sector Development Process. Time is tight, so we'll keep moving. Just as a reminder, this is a webinar format, so your cameras and microphones should automatically be muted. Please send any questions you have today using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can also leave comments for presenters in the chat box using the chat function at the bottom of the screen. We will be addressing Q&As aloud at the end of following the second presentation, but we will also be monitoring the Q&A for quick answers or clarification answers throughout the presentations. And just a note that the slides and the recording link from this call will be shared afterwards. So to get us started, I'll welcome Martha Stevenson, Senior Director for Strategy and Research on the WWF US Forest Team. Martha, please take it away.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for an update on these two sister projects. Tim, could you go to the next slide, please? So we'll dive right in, and I'll quickly introduce you to the flag sector, the FOLU sector, the agriculture, forestry, and other land uses, and talk about why it's important, and then hand over first to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol for an update on that work, and then update you all on the flag project. So the FOLU sector, as I said, represents food, agriculture, forestry, everything that's happening on the land, and represents about 24% of global greenhouse gas emissions. These are largely non-fossil emissions or biogenic emissions, and a really important area that we need to focus if we're going to achieve well below 2 degree or 1.5 degree trajectory for the planet. To date, there's been a lot of really great work that has been done providing guidance on this sector, but it hasn't been consolidated or formalized, and there are still some open questions that we need to debate and find the best solutions for when it comes to corporate accounting for these sectors. So we're looking at things like how to account for forest systems, forest management, for restoration, for deforestation emissions, looking at what happens with fire, what happens with manure management, and fertilizer applications, and of course, soil respiration. So all of these systems are the subject of the work that we are currently doing. Next slide, please. And in response to the lack of guidance, both on the accounting side and on the target setting side, we have advanced these two projects simultaneously and in partnership with each other in order to make sure that we're providing adequate guidance to the corporate sector in this space. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol update is being led by the World Resources Institute and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And they're developing standards on land sector and removals, and also removals more broadly beyond the land sector. And the FLAG project is being led by WWF, who is a partner organization of the Science-Based Targets Initiative and the land sector lead. And so we'll be developing methods and guidance to allow the forest, land, and agriculture sectors to set science-based targets that include these aspects in their well below 2 and 1.5 degree trajectories. Next slide, please. And how these two pieces of collateral work in partnership. So typically what happens is that companies will use the Greenhouse Gas Protocol guidance to establish what their baseline emissions and now removals are. And then they'll use that information to input into the FLAG pathways guidance to set their target for what their level of ambition needs to be to match a 1.5 degree trajectory. Then they'll disclose both their baseline and what their target is through platforms like CDP and others. And then actually the important part, take actions to reduce those emissions and address key hotspots in their supply chain, and then go back and use the Greenhouse Gas Protocol tools to update either annually or on a periodic basis their progress and their baseline over time. So that's how these tools work together. And with that, I will hand it over to WRI and WBCSD. Thank you.
Hi, thanks a lot, Martha. This is David Rich from WRI. Hello, everybody. Talk about the Greenhouse Gas Protocol project first. So for context, the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is an initiative of WRI and WBCSD. We've developed many greenhouse gas accounting and reporting standards and guidance over the years, including the ones on the screen. By way of quick overview, the corporate standard is the basis for all companies' annual greenhouse gas inventories. It defines scope 1, 2, and 3, where scope 1 is direct emissions from owned or controlled operations. Scope 2 is indirect emissions from purchased electricity, and scope 3 is all other indirect emissions in the value chain. We have additional standards and guidance for scope 2 and scope 3 accounting. We also have sector-specific guidance for a number of sectors. Of note is the agriculture guidance, which is for agricultural producers doing their scope 1 and 2 inventories primarily. We have product standard, which is product level greenhouse gas inventory or carbon footprint accounting. And we have the project protocol for quantifying greenhouse gas impacts of mitigation projects, and the policy and action standard, which is quantifying greenhouse gas impacts of actions at any scale, including larger scale actions than projects. So we have on the next slide. Next slide, please. Thanks. Very limited guidance on corporate level greenhouse gas accounting for land sector activities to date prior to this process. We do have some existing guidance for other applications or some narrower applications. So in the case of the agriculture guidance, as I said, it's for agriculture producers looking at their scope 1 and 2 inventory. The product standard does have guidance on land use change accounting in the context of product level inventories. We have a mitigation goal standard aimed at countries and cities, which has a chapter on including land sector impacts in national and subnational greenhouse gas targets. And we have LULUCF sector guidance for project accounting. So for projects in the land use change and forestry sector, guidance on project level accounting. But we don't have comprehensive corporate level scope 1, 2, and 3 guidance for all land sector activities, which is what we're embarking on now. Next, please. When we started the project, we did a survey of stakeholders to determine the need for new guidance on these different topics, and we found that there was a high need for many of these topics on the screen. So natural or biogenic CO2 removals, technological CO2 removals, such as from direct air capture, bioenergy and other biogenic products, and land use change. So we use this as the basis for moving forward to develop guidance on all these topics for corporate level accounting. Next, please. So this new initiative, which we're in the midst of, is to provide corporate level accounting and reporting guidance for greenhouse gases from land use and management, land use change, CO2 removals and storage from both biogenic and technological forms of CO2 removal, and biogenic products across the value chain. It's taking a value chain approach, building on the corporate standard and the scope 3 standard. So it applies to producers and consumers, and any company all along the value chain, looking upstream and downstream at to develop a comprehensive greenhouse gas inventory, including land sector impacts and all other impacts. And by including this comprehensive inventory, including land sector impacts, the intent is that the inventory will then support companies in informing their mitigation strategies, including land sector impacts, setting greenhouse gas targets and tracking performance over time, reporting greenhouse gas inventories and regularly reporting on progress, and ultimately supporting the Paris Agreement goal of balancing emissions and removals globally by mid-century and meeting the 1.5 degree goal by including land sector impacts and CO2 removals in their inventories and GHG management. Next, please. To develop the guidance, we are following a multi-stakeholder process. the same way we do with all GHG protocol standards. We invite a wide range of stakeholders to participate in the process, from companies, NGOs, academia, government, to participate in a number of different groups or committees. In this process, we have WRI and WBCSD serving as the secretariat. We have an advisory committee and 3 technical working groups, and we have a review group and pilot testing group. Over the last year, the technical working groups and advisory committee have been working to develop a first draft, where we've had a number last year, many discussions about all the various accounting issues at play in this sector, and are now working to develop a first draft of the guidance. We've brought all the working groups together to produce a single guidance document covering all of the activities I mentioned, and are currently working toward a first draft. The first draft will be available for review by the review group toward the middle of this year. And following that, we'll go to a pilot testing process. We invite companies to test out the guidance in practice and provide feedback on how it works on the ground. And we invite you all to participate in those 2 groups, review group or pilot testing group, if you're not already signed up to receive those updates. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Amir from WBCSD to get into some more details. Thanks.
Thank you so much, David. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. I will provide some more information, some more insight about the content of the new greenhouse gas protocol on land sector and removals. As David was mentioning, the existing greenhouse gas protocols, they mainly focus on the emission side. There has been precedence on including removals in the greenhouse gas protocols, as well as including land sector emissions. But the main focus has been regarding accounting for and reporting emissions, mainly from fossil fuel carbon pools to atmospheric carbon pools. With the new guidance, we're bringing the removals to the front page, in fact, and looking at 4 different carbon pools: the land-based carbon pools, which, as you know, they have different subcategories of basically the above or below ground biomass, as well as the soil carbon pools, as well as the other type of important carbon pools, mainly biogenic, the product carbon pools, which typically have a permanence of less than 100 years. And also looking at indeed geologic carbon pools, which can be used for storage of carbon removals storage. And finally, the ocean-based carbon pools. Regarding this, so we are looking at the emissions and the exchange of carbon, exchange of CO2 and carbon between these carbon pools, as well as the atmospheric carbon pools, and providing guidance on accounting for and reporting emissions and removals based on the fluctuations in carbon stock. One final remark is that during the process, we have realized that there's not yet enough insights and information regarding the ocean-based carbon pool. So although we're referring to it, we are not providing detailed guidance on this specific topic. Tim, if I can ask you please to go to the next slide. And one before, I feel you just double click. Thank you so much. The new greenhouse gas protocol provides guidance on the different sources of emissions and removals across the land sector. We're specifically looking at providing guidance on land use change and land management carbon impacts, as well as specific guidance on calculating and reporting biogenic product carbon impacts, also including any other land management related GHG emissions, not necessarily carbon related, but also other types of GHG emissions and other GHG emissions, mainly fossil fuel, that arise from activities on land. Looking for the companies that have operations on land, namely forestry or agriculture companies, these activities and emissions and removals from these activities will be included in their scope 1. And looking at the company downstream the supply chain, on top of the impacts, emissions from the above boxes or activities, also the production GHG emissions, as well as any other processing or transportation impacts, should also be included and reported within scope 3 of the company's downstream. So any company downstream the supply chain which uses or employs biogenic products, we will also provide guidance on how to report and account for biogenic carbon emissions or removals for scope 3. Again, this protocol builds on the existing guidance as protocol within the greenhouse gas protocol family. So indeed, some of these topics, for example, the product carbon impact or the processing GHG emissions are linked to other existing greenhouse gas protocols and sort of complementary. Next slide, please. I go a bit more into details on the guidance we're providing regarding accounting for and reporting land use change. And in the next slide, I will also go through the land management carbon impacts. For land use change, the guidance is providing support for and guidance for accounting for and reporting emissions or removals due to land use change for the companies to be reported within scope 1 or the scope 3 of the companies, depending on where they sit within the supply chain. Once again, for the land-based, for the companies that have activities on land, the emissions or removals due to activities should be reported within their scope 1. And again, if you're a company downstream or uses biogenic product, all the impacts on land should be reported within the scope 3. We are also aware of the existing challenge regarding data scarcity and traceability within the supply chains. So we're also providing guidance regarding reporting impact when there is a direct access for the supplier and where there's less traceability. So just for example, by knowing the sourcing regions. And we're including up to the existing discussions, the matrix for direct land use change emissions, as well as the statistical land use change emissions, mainly in the absence of direct land use change, and which is actually called a proxy of direct land use change impact. And both of these metrics, the existing decisions is that will be reported within the scopes, while we are also providing other complementary land tracking category and providing guidance for the companies to report on these land on tracking categories, mainly out of the scopes, which have a more global perspective. The matrix we're looking at are indirect land use change emissions, carbon opportunity costs, as well as land occupations, which will be required to be reported, but out of the scopes. And a final technical slide. Thank you, Tim, already for going to the next slide. And regarding land management carbon stock changes, first of all, the images on the right looks at the different types of land cover we're covering in this guidance, as well as the different types of carbon pools. The reporting guidance defines CO2 emissions where net carbon stock decreases occur in any of the carbon pools, and defines a CO2 removals when net carbon stock increases occur if they meet the certain criteria for reporting removals, which is now under development, but very much closely closely relates to the issues of permanence or monitoring. And for accounting for estimating and reporting carbon removals, there are different methods under consideration and cited within the greenhouse gas protocol guidance. The carbon stock change factor, the model-based approaches, which are based on mathematical approaches mainly, the remote sensing-based approaches, the satellites as well as aerial sensing methods, as well as finally measurement-based approaches and hybrid approaches, which could be a mix of any of the one and two based on the availability of data. Yes, thank you, Tim. For now, already going to the last slide. And just to wrap this up and give this stage back to our colleagues from WWF, David already brought up and discussed the project timeline, and this gives you a better overview of where we are. At the moment, we are finalizing the first draft, which we hope we will be publishing hopefully in the second quarter of this year. And we then go through a detailed stakeholder and a pilot testing review. And then we move on developing the second and the third draft. The guidance will be reviewed once more by the external review group we have already put together, and still increasing. And then the final guidance is expected to be published by Q3 2022. We would very much welcome your inputs on the greenhouse gas protocol. If you're interested to join the review and the pilot testing group, this is still open. Please feel free to reach out to any of us from my colleagues from WRI or me. That will be assisted. With this, I wrap this up, and I think I hand back to Krista.
Great, thank you. So now we'll turn to the Science-Based Targets Flag Initiative. Of course, most of you are familiar, the Science-Based Targets Initiative as the overarching framework for the Flag project is a collaboration providing this consistent vision and approach for corporations to set greenhouse gas emissions reductions that are in line with the Paris Agreement. And it's a partnership between CDP, UN Global Compact, WRI, and WWF in collaboration with We Mean Business. Next slide. As Science-Based Targets Initiative has grown over time, we regularly undertake sector development projects to provide specific sectoral guidance on emissions reduction and mitigation in various sectors. And so ongoing now are shipping and aviation sector development projects. And then here, the one we're talking about today, this forest, land, and agriculture sector development project in Flag. Others are ongoing as well, are wrapping up oil and gas, power generation, financial institutions, and so on. The Flag sector development project is a little bit unique from the other sector development projects. And so I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on how that's looking and working. Next slide. So here's an example for how Flag will look when it's sort of fully finished towards the end of this year. Let's say you're a food and beverage processing company. Your current target overarching on the left side of the screen says something like, Company X commits to reduce absolute scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions 42% by FY 2030 and scope 3 emissions by 30%. And then, of course, there's sort of the full accounting, the scope 1 and 2 target, set up by what the total emissions are for a given year, and then separately the scope 3 target. The way that it works right now, as you see from the symbols, is that the emissions that are related to energy and industry are combined where accounted with any land-based emissions. And so there's no disaggregation of those emissions. And this is what the Flag project is seeking to do. Next slide. So what this would look like for a company once the Flag target is established and added is that you would have likely the same sort of overarching target. But what you would do as a company is look into your emissions profile, make sure that your accounting is complete, of course, based on something like the Greenhouse Gas Protocol guidance update for what should be included, and then find the places where those emissions for the company are related to land and separate them out. So in many cases, we expect that, for example, for this food and beverage processing company, those emissions are going to be in the scope 3 sort of target realm, oftentimes in a category 1 for purchased goods and services, also frequently category 11, use of sold products, can occur other places. You would look for those land-based emissions and separate them out. In this case, let's say there were 5 million tons from land in some regard, and then they're moved aside. You see here, they're at the bottom of the screen, and you use a Flag target specifically for those land-based emissions, while the target for everything else stays the same for that company. Next slide. And within that Flag target then, once you've identified those land-based emissions for which you're setting a separate target, we are developing 2 different tools. So the first is a Flag sector pathway, which really encompasses all land-based emissions. This is most appropriate for companies with diversified emissions or who are further from direct production. And there will also be guidance for companies for sure on which of these tools is most appropriate to use, but that's the first one. The second one is commodity-based pathways. So these commodity-based pathways are really designed more for companies with focused commodity emissions, and they're available for 9 different commodities. The data underlying each of these, the first is from a major review paper by Rowe et al. That combined all of the bottom-up assessments along with all of the IAM data to say what is the mitigation potential in the land sector. And then on the commodity pathways side, those are developed in a collaboration between PBL and the University of Aberdeen, using as an underlying framework the image IAM data. And so both of these data sets and processes are both peer-reviewed and fully available publicly. Next slide. I'm going to dig into each of those a little bit more. So this is the first one, that flag sector pathway. And the way that it works is it looks at what is the mitigation potential across these different wedges and says this is what it will look like when you sum them and average them over time. So what it includes are, starting from that light green category, the largest one, land use change potential, improved agriculture, shifting diets, reducing food loss and waste, restoring forests, improved sustainable forest management, enhancing agricultural soil carbon, and BECCS, which are going to be reallocated actually across the other categories. So those are the categories that are included for all of these land-based emissions. And this approach says you can take them all together and average them to look at what is the appropriate flag pathway. Next slide. In that second approach, the commodity pathway approach, which is appropriate for companies with major commodity-based emissions, there are distinct pathways for mitigation for 9 different commodities, and there will be a 10th. So it's beef, dairy, pork, poultry, meat, and eggs, roundwood, which is the one that's under development, rice, soy, palm oil, maize, and wheat. And these commodity pathways differ from the flag sectoral pathway in that they are based on emissions intensity. So they're developed to look at not just the gross emissions, but emissions of carbon dioxide equivalent per ton of production of that commodity. So this is the second option that's available. Next slide. I want to give you a flavor of the kind of technical issues that we're developing in this process so that you can know where we're at, and also feel free to ask questions. So these are some of the issues that we've already addressed. The first is combining data sources and models. As I mentioned, we're looking at 2 different approaches from slightly different data sets. We decided this was important to give the full range of potential for companies that are looking at how to account and set targets for these flag-based emissions. The second is temperature targets. Traditionally, under Science-Based Targets Initiative, there's an option for a well below 2-degree pathway and a 1.5-degree pathway. As it happens, we don't have those 2 separate pathways available in terms of the data for all of the approaches. And furthermore, in the flag sector, the difference in mitigation between a 1.5 and a 2-degree pathway over the next 10 to 15 years is essentially nothing. It's very, very small difference. And so we're moving forward with one pathway, which is likely to be considered as a 1.5-degree pathway, noting that there really isn't a big difference between 1.5 and well below 2 for this sector. The third aspect is accounting for removals. Traditionally, under science-based targets, of course, this is all about emissions reduction. No removals or carbon sequestration is considered historically. However, and this has maybe been the #1 question that we've been getting, because we recognize that for the flag sector under AFOLU, when you think about the mitigation potential, we know that about half of the mitigation potential is from removals, from carbon sequestration. And so the flag pathway will include removals in some form. We are working on the development of options for that. Part of that is about what works under the existing science-based targets framework, and the other is making sure that we're well in line with the greenhouse gas protocol, but removals will be included. Next slide. And here are to give you a flavor of a few of the issues that are underway. I mentioned the roundwood commodity pathway. So the 9 grain and meat pathways are already finished and available, but there's not yet a roundwood commodity pathway, and we're in the process of developing that now to make sure that that option is available as well, looking at the relevant and available data sets. A second one is land use change in the commodity pathways. So those existing commodity pathways, the 9 that I mentioned, are available, but they have not yet included land use change in the pathway, and so those will be added as well. The current status is that we're comparing the existing methods and working out building in those land use change specifications in the draft model. And then the third, of course, I always want to highlight continued alignment with the greenhouse gas protocol. For companies that use greenhouse gas protocol and then have also an SBTi target, we need to make sure, of course, that the guidance and the target setting pathway are very much in agreement and alignment. And so we continue our close coordination on that front. Next slide. Here's a little update on the timeline. We're about a year in, and we've developed the draft version 1 of the model, which we will be updating, as I mentioned, with some of those parameters that are missing, and moving forward to version 2 of the final model and guidance. We plan to wrap up at the end of this calendar year, and we'll move into the public consultation and testing period sometime in Q3. Next slide. So I'll turn it over to you, Tim. I think that's sort of what I wanted to update you on in terms of the FLAG sector development process.
Great. Thank you so much, Krista, and thank you to all of our speakers. I think we're right on time, and thank you too to the army of folks answering questions live. I think we'll move now to the formal Q&A. Martha, if you want to start to walk us through some of the open questions, and then maybe if there's a lull, we'll have the opportunity to also review some of the most popular answered questions. I'll also just mention to the audience, you can upvote questions that you see in the list, and that will help us to prioritize.
Sure. So I will start with a few to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol team. So several questions about bioenergy have come up and just whether that will be addressed as part of this guidance or not. Matt or David, do you want to take that one?
Yes, we'll explain how accounting works for biogenic products, including bioenergy. So I guess the short answer is yes, if that was the extent of the question. Thanks.
Great. And several people also had asked how to engage in the pilots. And so both in the chat and in the Q&A, we've posted a link. And so if people want to sign up there, that can help you get engaged within that work. David, would you talk a little bit, there are several questions about removals and how will removals be thought of within the land sector, and then how will removals be thought of outside of the land sector? And could you talk a little bit about the scope of this document and what it's providing guidance on with respect to that? And then probably to answer together several questions about how additionality and kind of separate reporting will be treated with regard to that as well. So you could probably answer those together.
Sure. You know, I think the one of the tasks we're trying to do with the greenhouse gas protocol work is explain how companies do their, there's comprehensive greenhouse gas inventory, including scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, to also reflect CO2 removals that are occurring either in the owned or controlled operations of the company or in the value chain. So it's about, the removals occurring, for example, in the life cycle of products they're purchasing or consuming or producing, or that they have CO2 removals within their own operations, and how that accounting should work, which is a subject of ongoing discussion as we're trying to work toward the first draft in terms of how exactly that works. But that's the focus, in addition to all land sector emissions, and bringing that into companies' greenhouse gas inventories from land management, land use change, both from lands that the company owns or controls or lands in the value chain. So we realize that not every company has CO2 removals in their operations or value chains, depending on their sector. And so we have a chapter clarifying how greenhouse gas credits are accounted for and reported in the context of a greenhouse gas inventory report. So, if a company is engaging with credits from another sector, just to reiterate, the current requirements are that any purchases of credits are reported separately from emissions reported in scope 1, 2, and 3. So the scopes reflect kind of the physical emissions occurring in a company's operations or value chain, and any purchases or transactions of credits or other instruments are reported separately from the scopes. And credits are subject to additionality requirements and other quality criteria, permanence, leakage, avoidance of double counting, and so on. Those apply to any credits that a company would be engaging with.
had myself muted. Krista, I'll pop over to you for a couple flag questions. So one was, will diet shift be included in the overall model?
Yep, thanks for asking that question. As you might have seen, diet shift is included in that first option, the row sectoral pathway. And so when they did that analysis, diet shift is considered one of the mitigation options. And so it is included in that realm.
Great. And then one following up on the commodity pathways. So we have some folks asking how to currently access the commodity pathways and whether coffee will be included. A couple questions also about whether aquaculture and seafood would be included. And I'll just, Krista, I'll leave you to the other part, but first say, we see this as a huge gap, and particularly in relation to that diet shift. If we're going to be shifting diets, then we need to make sure that, foods like aquaculture derived foods are also included in the integrated assessment models that we use as the backbone of these, and those are currently not in there. And so we do see a body of work not included under the scope of this project, but that would be really important to kind of build out this holistic approach. But Krista, as far as the commodity pathways, if you could just orient people to the PBL tools that are available.
Yes, indeed. So as I mentioned, these commodity pathways are built off of the PBL data analysis that was done in 2016 together with University of Aberdeen. And those documents are public. We'll go ahead probably and share those so that everyone has access to that and the raw data, either in the follow-up to this message along with a recording or in a separate message so that you can see all of that information firsthand.
Great, thanks. Matt, I'm going to pick on you next. Paraphrasing here, but a few questions about how, and I guess I would preempt this by saying that we're still in drafting mode for a lot of this work and we haven't pilot tested it. So we do have this, learning opportunity coming up in the process of both of these projects. So in that context, Matt, how is the practicality of moving data from farmers and forest owners to downstream users being considered as you all draft these documents?
Thanks, Martha. Yeah, that's a great question. So we've gone into this process within our working groups to address these questions both from a scope 1 perspective or from the land managers, as well as a scope 3 perspective from downstream consumers of land-based commodities. So we intend to develop a chapter that will focus on data collection methods and the types of traceability systems and monitoring systems that will need to be in place in order to account for these within a company's scope 3. And I think that there will be a lot of lessons to learn from the pilot testing phase. So the companies on the call today, we certainly encourage you to sign up for that and to help us pilot test this guidance to understand some of the practicality issues there.
Great, thank you. So a lot of questions coming in about the relationship between the guidance within the greenhouse gas protocol, the flag work, and the relationship to the Science-Based Targets Initiative net zero criteria that are currently out for public review. And so I'm going to pick on Chris Weber for this one, who's on the technical advisory group for the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And just to remind people, so the flag work, this is for 5 to 15-year targets, and net zero targets, obviously we're looking much further out, 2040, 2050 timeframes. So there are different timeframes that we're considering here. But Chris, would you like to help us understand how these things relate to each other, and in particular, the guidance on neutralization and compensation that's been discussed in the net zero criteria? And also then I would invite the GHGP people on the heels of that, if you guys want to talk about whether you're digging into compensation and neutralization guidance specifically in your documentation or not.
So the question was, would I like to take that question? No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. Okay, this is a complicated question, though. So for those that have seen the net zero criteria that are out for public comment right now, you'll note there's kind of two types of targets discussed within the criteria. There's the net zero targets themselves, which are generally thought to be long term, and then these interim targets that are in the more short term. The flag methods are all around science-based targets, which are by definition of the 5 to 15-year time horizon. As of now, there is not full alignment between the interim targets of the net zero criteria and the science-based targets that are known as science-based targets. But we're expecting that as the net zero criteria get finalized through the public review, there will be further consolidation and rectification to make those two things match. So basically, in the future, we expect that any of the flag methods that would be appropriate for flag companies for science-based targets would also be appropriate for the interim targets that would lead to a net zero target. There's bigger questions about whether non-flag companies could use flag methodologies for parts of their net zero target, and those ones have not been fully resolved yet and are in discussion at this time.
Great. And Matt, I'm going to come back to you. Several questions about soil carbon and how that will be treated on the greenhouse gas protocol side. And then Krista, I would invite you for a follow-up on how we're thinking about it in the flag work.
Yeah, happy to take that one. So again, this guidance does intend to cover how do companies estimate changes in carbon stock within all land-based carbon pools. So that would include biomass, dead organic matter, and soil. Where our technical working group is currently drafting guidance on soil carbon accounting. And there, as Amir had shared earlier, we're looking at both measurement-based approaches and modeling-based approaches to estimate potential increases in soil carbon stock. However, we also envision that there will be some activity-based methods that might be used to ensure that decreases in soil carbon stock are not occurring. So that's sort of the latest status of our soil carbon guidance.
And I could add, in terms of soil carbon on the flag science-based target side, soil carbon sequestration, as you saw, is included in the row pathway. So that's a mitigation option. And of course, some of the finer details to be worked out yet include how to make sure that it's linked well with the process under greenhouse gas protocol and soil carbon storage. On the commodity pathway side, we're scoping out, soil carbon is not currently in those, it's under the broader category of land use change, where we're scoping out how to add that into the pathways.
Great. And Krista, I'm going to follow on quickly. Could you just talk a little bit about kind of how within FLAG and consistent with SBTi, we're setting these global pathways, but then what companies do specifically will be very place-based, and just talk about kind of the different resolution of those two things.
Right, and please feel free to add, Martha, as helpful. But of course, science-based targets sets global pathways, so it's sort of some kind of global average. We recognize that obviously when you go to do the mitigation work, when you're implementing projects and responses, that's a very locally based effort. And so we first, I guess one thing to say would be that as we're developing these global pathways, we're also looking towards saying, okay, what are the implementation options that companies have to make sure that there is feasibility between what you're using to set your target and being able to demonstrate that when you have your options for implementation. And then further, of course, although the targets are global, we expect that along with what you saw in greenhouse gas protocol, companies will use a variety of different approaches in terms of both doing the implementation and tools available to measure change in specific places. Martha, anything you want to add?
Nope, that was perfect. Thanks. All right, I'm going to do a bit of a round robin just because we have so many questions, and go to the panelists and ask you all to choose your favorite question that hasn't been answered yet, or if there already has been a question that you want to provide more detail into, then please do that. So Amir, I'm going to start with you.
Thank you. Sorry, I was unmuting myself. I think there was a question about land use change and the history, and how, if it is included in the in the guidance, and how is it treated in the guidance. So maybe I could provide some background here. The way we are looking at it regarding land use change, yes, indeed, we are incorporating the history of land use change, and we're trying to align with the existing frameworks and initiatives that they have already provided guidance on this. And at the moment, we're still discussing within the technical working groups, but the position is that we will look at the historical land use change, sort of based on the existing initiatives, looking 20 years back for the history of land use change, and also a sort of a 20 years framework to allocate the impacts to the products that are coming out of land for the next 20 years. So this is the type of framework we're looking at. We're also discussing if we could provide more flexible time horizon for to assess the impacts of land use change, depending if there's, for example, a longer crop cycle, more than 20 years, or a significantly less crop cycle.
Great, thanks. David, you have the floor.
Thanks. There's such a huge volume of comments, and I actually just want to thank everyone for writing in comments. I assume we'll have a record of all of these, and we'll spend more time with them and make sure we're addressing all the issues you all think should be addressed, some of which are being addressed, and in some cases we're saying we might have an answer. In other cases, we don't have an answer yet because it's a subject of ongoing discussions, but it will be addressed in the guidance. There may be a few issues where you're highlighting really important subjects that we need to consider adding in that may not be part of the current scope. So it's a little hard to pick where to begin. I think, yeah, I think there are a few questions about how the crediting systems that are in place now in the land sector intersect with kind of bringing land sector emissions and removals into company scope 3 emissions inventories and targets, some of which have been excluded in the past. And I think that's an area where additional clarity is going to be needed, including on avoidance of double counting of emissions or emission reductions or removals that are credited, given that key feature and principle of credits is the avoidance of double counting between two parties. So I think someone asked about that, and just to say we'll want to clarify that in the new guidance. But anyway, I'll leave it there given how many comments there are. Thank you.
Great. Chris, let's go to you next.
I'm going to take, excuse me, I'm going to take a question from Yasmin Sarella about diet shift and land use change, which is a great question in terms of the double counting between the two. And I think it's fair to say that dietary shift is one of the most uncertain categories that we're talking about here. The estimates are all over the place in terms of how important it is, and it largely gets down to kind of how the accounting works with land use change and whether land use change emissions are included in the dietary wedge or not, and also like whether kind of it's assumed that land could then go on to sequester further carbon. We are following the analysis by Rowe et al., which is the best meta-analysis out there, that tried to resolve some of these double counting issues to kind of put the supply side and demand side measures into the separate buckets. But I think that the actual application of it for the example companies you mentioned, like McDonald's or JBS, we're still working through exactly how this will work, because it will be in different scope 3 categories for different types of companies. And we'll get back to you when we have a better answer, but it's a great question.
Great, thanks, Chris. I think something we've seen as we've reviewed a lot of the models is depending on who the target audience is, they tend to weight or allocate emissions differently by who they're trying to influence. And so because this work in particular has been targeted at companies within the land sector, that's where we've tried to kind of focus the flag work, at least to make sure we're opening up the levers within that particular sector where you all can take action. Let's see, Monica, I invite you to grab a question and step in here.
Thanks. Chris took mine. So it looks like we just got another one on accounting for food loss and waste. So let me read that one and then I will respond. How
about I'll give you a minute and jump to Krista. Is that okay? Great.
Yeah, I'd love to build off of actually what Chris just mentioned. I've seen a few questions in the chat that are talking about, you know, if you are a company that really your forest, land, flag related emissions are in your scope 3 much further downstream, or if you're a company that's trying to figure out, are you going to be using the overall flag sector pathway or the commodity pathway? So to clarify, something that I hadn't mentioned is, well, first of all, as I did say, we will have guidance about when to use each tool and recommendations. And further, we anticipate that for some companies, there are many different kinds of formats and setups where you may be using actually both tools. So you could have some use of the commodity pathways if there's a major commodity that's extremely important in terms of your flag related emissions and target setting, and then a significant group of other emissions for which the sector tool is more appropriate. So we do anticipate that there's a scenario in which companies who are interested in doing that would be able to use both. And further to say that for many of the companies who are participating in science-based targets, a lot of these flag land-related emissions are not in the scope 1, but they're rather in the scope 3, sort of further downstream. And that's why the sort of overall sort of general sector pathway is so important to us. So thanks for those questions.
Great. Monica, food waste.
Yeah, so the question around how are we accounting for food loss and waste. So in the row pathway, the food loss and waste bucket is mainly focused on the emissions associated with the end of life of the food loss and waste, the emissions associated with the production, with the land use change piece of that would be captured in some of the other buckets that are in the row wedges. So yes, agree that the assumption that 1 ton of food not wasted is equal to 1 ton of food not produced is not necessarily true. And so we are taking that into consideration when we're developing the target pathway that includes the food loss and waste.
Great. Thank you, Monica. Matt, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, so I see Chris has handed me the biogenic carbon accounting question. I mean, I think I will first start with answering this question by, we are actively discussing this within our technical working group at this time. So we're somewhat limited in how much detail we can provide on the accounting approach that will make it into the first draft of the guidance. But I can give a brief summary of where we're at when it comes to accounting for biogenic CO2 emissions. There's been a lot of debate within our technical working groups about using what we call stock change based approaches, which would be similar to IPCC, National Greenhouse Gas Inventory accounting, and flow-based carbon accounting approaches. And the current status of our discussion is that we recognize both information is important. So we're currently in the process of advancing a draft where we would be looking at quantifying these impacts based on the changes in carbon stock on the land, but then also recognizing the need to report biogenic emissions. So I think the short answer there is we're trying to include all of the impacts so that we're not just using an assumption of carbon neutrality, but that companies will have to demonstrate what the impacts are on the land to carbon stocks, and that would get included within the scopes. But I think some of this is still being resolved within our working group, and you'll see an answer to this in the first draft of the guidance once we have that available for review later this year.
Great. Thank you, Matt. And I am going to pick on you again while you're in the hot seat. Several questions about harvested wood products and how they're going to be, or insights on how they're going to be treated within the guidance, and in particular, kind of how land management and harvested wood products are going to be thought about as two parts of the same process.
Yeah, thanks for all these questions, Martha. I think that one is a little bit trickier for us to give an answer on, because we are still trying to think about some of the permanence considerations when it comes to accounting for carbon that's stored within products. And I think that there isn't a general sense within our working groups of which direction we will go there. So I think that one, we hope to have an answer when we have the first draft of the guidance. I think the way that we're currently thinking about this, as I mentioned before, is looking at the changes in carbon stock on the land. But then there is a question about how do you then account for changes in product carbon stocks, or the long-term fate of the carbon that remains in wood. So apologies if we don't have a direct answer for that question at this time, but it is within the scope of this work, and we hope to provide an answer in the first draft of our guidance.
Great, thank you. Chris, a couple questions about the Science-Based Targets Initiative, and obviously we have sector pathways for multiple sectors, the aviation sector is underway, power sector, and how the combustion of, I guess, land-derived commodities will be treated in other pathways. Any insights on that? So it's kind of outside of the flag scope, but more in kind of biofuels and that type of space, and how SBTi will be including those.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think Martha and Krista both covered well kind of the logic of why we were doing the flag sectoral development and this the GHGP land sector guidance at the same time. But we also recognize that the land sector guidance will be useful to sectors outside of the flag sectors. When the SBTi is able to kind of actually uptake the final GHGP standard, I'm fairly certain that it will be applicable to all of the sectors for the portion of their emissions that are biogenics. But that will not be until the GHGP standard is ready for actual use.
Maybe there was another question about whether this means that within the flag pathways, removals would be included, as it's a longstanding criteria that removals are not included within the other pathways. And so, yes, that is our proposal here, but it would be contained within the land sector, because oftentimes you can't really distinguish like soils management, forest management from a reduction or removal, because it's relative to a reference state of what the practices are. And so that will be a criteria change, but it all has to go through a review process and be accepted by the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So we still have that technical review to go to, but that is our intention as we've been building out these pathways. Great. So I am gonna, anybody else have a burning question they want to jump in on? Otherwise, I think we can go ahead and close. A 1-minute question? No. Okay, great.
Right. Well, thanks so much, Martha, for leading us through that. And thank you to all our speakers. Again, also thank you to our project supporters. And thank you to all of you for your time and your attendance today. I think we had almost 500 folks on the webinar today. It's a great testament, not just to the interest in these two projects, but the importance of the topics that are being addressed. And as I think David kind of pointed out, your questions and your input are really critical to our processes. So please feel free to reach out, especially if you had a question that we couldn't answer or couldn't quite answer in detail today. Reach out to the two project contacts listed here on the screen. These slides and the recording from today's webinar will be shared with everyone who registered. So we'll end there. Thank you again for your time, and we look forward to engaging with you as both of these projects move forward. Have a great day.